Hello and welcome to RealLaurenLive, spirituality, health, and lifestyle podcast. Today I have guest Sarah Tava joining me. Hey, Sarah.
Hi.
Thanks for joining. Sarah is actually my sister-in-law, which is super cool that we're getting to do this together. And I had kind of asked people that had been following along, what topics should we talk about? What's something that, maybe some people don't know about, or people are in it, whether they're trying to adopt or have been adopted. And Sarah had the great idea about talking about the adoption process. And she personally knows because she is adopted. And so that's kind of how we decided to do the topic today. I want to do a quick intro on Sarah, and then I really want her to steal the show and talk about her story. But she was born and raised in California, and she currently lives in Colorado. She lives with her 3 dogs. Now it's 2. She just had one that passed, but they are like a Frenchie bulldog loving family. She lives with her husband, who is my brother-in-law, and then her dad as well. And she has worked in the apparel industry for years and currently works in the outdoor space apparel industry as well. So let's dive in. And I would love for you to talk about your personal story, your adoption story, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So I was a newborn adoption. So there's a lot of different kinds of adoption. And mine was probably the most traditional route. So I was actually adopted when I was 2 weeks old. And I was adopted through a religious adoption agency in the time. And I think, for me, it was kind of interesting. I was born in 1984. And so that was actually the last year of a closed adoption. So you'll see right now in the news, there's a lot of conversation around making original birth certificates available to adoptees. And the reason is because if you were part of a closed adoption, like if I were to request my birth certificate from the state of California, it would actually come with my adoptive parents' names on it. So, you're really sealed from knowing who you are and where you came from. And, that for a lot of adoptees is a really, really hard thing to grapple with as they grow up. And so, for me, I was actually pretty, traditionally raised. I grew up in Southern California. I always knew I was adopted, and that's also something else to consider. There's definitely a term called late term or a late adoptee, which is where they find out much later in life that they were adopted. And so for me, I'm really grateful that I was definitely not a late discovery adoptee. I remember being very young and knowing I was adopted, and it was always, portrayed in our household as a really great thing. I felt very blessed and lucky. Those were the terms that were thrown around a lot. And so for me, I never saw it as a crutch or as a wound, and more so saw it as, I was raised by this wonderful family and, was given this other chance. And it took me a lot longer in life to really unpack what that meant. But I think overall, my childhood was pretty traditional.
Wow. Okay. So sorry, I'm a little confused. So when you were born in 1984 and your birth certificate, you were given that information with your birth mother's name on it, or you were not?
No, I was not. So
okay.
Mine was actually part of what they call the closed adoption or a sealed adoption. So
okay.
It means that all of my legal paperwork has my adoptive parents' names on it.
But now it's different.
Yeah, there's still closed adoption now. It's definitely a lot less common. I think, the adoption industry has evolved in many different ways. And for the most part, it, has always been painted this really beautiful fairy tale for me. And I think as I've gotten further and further within the industry, I've learned just quite how unethical a lot of it is. And so for me, my records were absolutely sealed. So I had no idea where I came from, who I was, my medical history. I spent every single medical appointment during history just writing NA across it. I'm adopted, and that's what it is. And, there's a lot of stigmas that come with adopted children. And so I think for me, I didn't really have a great understanding of my heritage until I got much, much older and actually located my birth mom.
Yeah. Wow. That is a lot. Okay. I don't know if we want to, maybe we dive more into like the industry and some of the unethical. That's a large part of why we wanted to do this and why you spoke out, I'm glad, about this topic, because it does need to be talked about. But before we get into that, let's talk about that. How did you find your mom? And I know you found, was it half sister or sisters?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how old were you?
So the way it worked with a closed adoption was you had to submit so essentially I would submit my paperwork, she would submit her paperwork, and then they would swap the paperwork. And so I actually submitted mine back in, when I was like probably 16 years old. And then I didn't hear anything until I was 26. So when I first got that phone call from social services, basically telling me that they had, located my birth mother, I had been working in the hospital industry at the time. And a part of my job was to actually remove babies that tested positive for meth and other drugs. Oh, wow. And so I, remember picking up the phone and I had switched careers and was working for a different job. And, they were inquiring around social services. And I just remember thinking like, oh, is this around, the hospital that I used to work at? Like, are you inquiring around, a case? And they were like, no, we just wanted to let you know, we've located your birth mother. And I was like, oh, like, okay, here we are. Now we have this like new path. And so I actually had my adoptive dad drive me down to social services in Los Angeles. And I remember walking in the door and the guy was like, I'm so sorry. Like, I'm so sorry. And I was like, what are you sorry about? Like, is she dead? Like, did she pass away? Yeah. And he was like, no, we're just really backed up here. And I remember thinking like, I don't understand. Like, well, how, when did she submit her paperwork? And he was like, when you were 2 weeks old. Oh, and so it essentially had taken them 10 years to process my paperwork.
Oh my gosh.
And so all they had was an old phone number, I believe, and an old address from 1984. And so I remember just being like, what do I even do with this? And so I, of course, called my husband and I'm like, they're telling me to hire a private investigator. Like, what do I even do with this? And he was like, give me the info. Like, I'll find her on the internet. And by the time I had driven back from LA to Orange County, sure enough, he had like found her old residence. And, without getting into too much of her personal story, I mean, I ended up reconnecting with her. Ended up finding out I have 2 half sisters. So we all have the same mom and we all 3 have different dads. And I've always been the baby of my family. And suddenly I had, a 12 and a 14-year-old half sister when I found them. And so that was really almost as much of a mind trip as it was to meet my birth mom, was to see these little souls who kind of looked like me and who kind of moved like me. And we had like a lot of the same mannerisms. And that was really, really interesting too.
That is interesting. Wow. What a story. That is insane about the backup. So she had, after you were 2 weeks old, she had submitted paperwork. Was that kind of to signal, like, if you ever wanted contact, she had given them hers and she wanted to meet you later?
Yeah. I mean, she was very young and obviously made the best decision for her. And, there's a lot of really great literature pieces right now around like the adoption industry, especially back in the 50s and the 60s. There's a really great book called The Women Who Went Away. And it's about these women who got pregnant out of wedlock and basically were forced to go off to these birthing homes and were basically forced into giving away their children. And in a way that's kind of similar to what my birth mom went through. Like, no one in her family knew she was pregnant, and she went away to this home in order to have me in a safe capacity, and ultimately made the best decision for her. And there's absolutely no will or ill will on my end in regards to that. Like, I can't even imagine what that would feel like to be that young and to have to make such an adult decision.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think there's so much to unpack in just that itself, like the coercion of women giving up children and the way that it was handled, especially from like a lot of religious institutes in the back. So I think that that's another piece of this too.
Wow. And how old was she when she had you?
Oh gosh, I want to say I feel like she was like 15 or 16.
Yeah, so really young.
Definitely young.
Wow.
Might have even been younger.
Oh my.
Yeah. So.
Okay. And again, whatever you care to share or don't care to share, I'm just grateful that you're sharing your story, because I know that'll be very inspiring for other people, or just, opening people's eyes to reality and how this all works. But do you know your your biological father?
I don't.
Okay.
No, I don't. So that's still a piece of the puzzle that's yet to be kind of unlocked. I know a few things about him in the sense of maybe his possible heritage and, but I don't know who he is just yet.
Totally. Okay. And then to kind of close on that part. So do you still converse with your mom on occasion?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with finding the girls, that was such an unexpected surprise. Like I guess a lot of adoptees, and I'll speak for myself, growing up, you always wonder, like, what would this other family feel like, or what would they be like? And I think, there is a really popular adult adoptee, and I believe foster child, that came out of the system. Her name is, oh my gosh, I just forgot her name, Tara Bauerr. And anyway, she says, essentially, I wish I lived in a world where I love my adoptees, and I also don't wish that they existed, like my adopted parents. Like, I wish that I could love my adopted parents at the same time, and then also not wish that for their existence in my life.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to hear someone like that express that kind of point of view, because it seems so taboo and ungrateful, and like you're not supposed to feel this way. But at the same time, the reality is, like, for that family to be formed, another family had to be broken.
Right. Yeah. And the realistic feelings and you know what I mean? Emotions that come along with it. Totally. Wow. Okay. And so then your childhood and everything, you said it was really happy, and you remember them telling you as a young age, like, you said you had a good, happy childhood, but I mean, there must have been times where it was difficult, I'm sure, right? Or just wondering about your mom as you got older, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, kind of going back to what I was saying about those stigmas, like I used to be told all the time on a regular basis, like, oh, you're so lucky. Like, you're so lucky that they found you, or you should be so grateful that you had the home that you had. And I also remember being introduced, all the time at family reunions, and not by anybody's ill intention, but, oh, this is Roy's daughter, she's adopted, and like, kind of that tagline always being stuck with you,
Sure.
And the reality is, like, if you looked at a family photo, like, you would never be like, oh, she's adopted. Like, I don't have it the same way transracial adoptees have it,
Sure.
where they're like such an obvious standout in their families. And so I think for that tagline to be always attached to you is also, something to kind of deal with and grapple with.
That's true. Yeah. I never thought about that. And, I'm sure friends or people at school, like, asking about it that may not understand it, things like that too. Like, oh, you're adopted, or yeah, totally.
Yeah. I mean, I don't ever remember looking at it as a negative. If anything, I always
but just people being curious and you having to talk about it, maybe.
Yeah, but I think, like, a lot of people do look at it as a negative. Like, they look at it as, like, they were a piece of trash, or they were given away, or they weren't wanted, or, and it's like, it's quite the opposite, like, I look at adoptees and also other children, like, in the sense of, like, you're so wanted. Yes. And, like, unfortunately, the way that our system works, like, the same tools that are given to adopted parents are not given to young birth parents. And so it's like, what if we invested the same way we invest in foster parents, with a monthly stipend or classes or child support, in the way that we could with young, unprepared youth, like, it would probably be a very different circumstance.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And I love your attitude on that. And I definitely agree. Like, you are wanted and you are valuable, and just as much as any other planned child or unplanned, there's plenty of unplanned children in the homes of their own parents, but sure. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So we kind of talked about that, and, what would you like to speak about? I mean, you've kind of touched on a few things. I mean, just like the backup of paperwork. And I actually, had a former coworker who adopted a baby, and I know they had to wait a really long time. They had to go through the whole process. Maybe you could speak to what does the process even look like? Like if someone's considering doing it, I know it can be very long and detailed. Anything about that you want to share?
Yeah, I think that like social media has changed our world in so many different ways, and it's also very much influenced the world of adoption. And I should just state, like, I'm not a social worker by any means, and I can only speak as someone who has, actually looked into the process myself. So my husband and I are in the process of actually becoming foster parents, and so when we started out on that journey, I had always had the goals to adopt. It was just something that, it was kind of like a pay it forward mentality. And even now I sit back and I realize that wasn't the right mentality to have, but, it was something that I thought that I could relate to a child through. And so I wanted to provide space for that little soul too. And so we started to look into the adoption industry, and it is just very seedy and like very deep. And, I remember I had probably 5 interviews with different agencies, and it was just all around, we considered international, we considered domestic, we considered, children with special needs. And so looking into all of that, there was like a common thread, and the thread was very much around like, well, how bad do you want a baby? How much money are you willing to pay? It felt very like black market baby. And that didn't sit well with me at all. I had one social worker who explained to me that, minority children would cost less than Caucasian children. And, it's just, then you get into the other side of the industry too, where like we talk about the coercion of women, and it's like you have women on Facebook groups who are trying to, pop on pre-pregnancy teen forums and like pushing adoption or pushing, financial backing. And so it has become this whole new beast with social media. And you have a lot of people out there who are pretending to be experts and really are kind of con artists in this sense. And so, like I've had multiple friends who have started adoption processes, and, the moms changed their mind halfway down the road. And then that money was gone, and that investment was gone as well. And so I think that, unfortunately, it's on both sides of that. There are definitely people in the system who want to take advantage of people who want children so badly. And that really led us and directed us towards, the option of foster care, or, and even within that, there's a term called foster to adopt. Yeah. And, that's actually not an appropriate way of adoption either. Like you should never enter into foster care looking to adopt, because ultimately that means that you're not doing the point of foster care. Foster care, the point is reunification and like getting that child back into their family, whether it's a family member, whether it's the parents, whether it's the support system of the family member. Like the goal is for that child to be reunified. And I think people that enter into the foster to adopt world, they may enter in with the best of intentions, but ultimately like that's not the way.
Interesting. So. Wow. That's a lot. Okay. So, and yeah, I mean, like I've heard that actually too about, non-Caucasian at the cost, which blows my mind that that's even like a thing. Like, how is that even possible? That's very upsetting.
Yeah. I mean, Black and brown children are openly less expensive to adopt, which is, pretty wild when you think about it in our time and with everything going on in our world. And at the same time, there's also a lot of conversation about transracial adoption and like, is it a good thing? Like, how does it feel for a child to grow up in, a single race environment, essentially? So it's a lot. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to adoption. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to foster care too. And I think if you are someone who's looking into one of those avenues, there are so many great resources too. Like Foster the Family is an account on Instagram, and I butchered her name earlier, but it was Tina Bauerr, and Tina, was a foster youth, is now, in the process of educating other adults in what it looks like, to adopt or to foster a child. And there's so many other great assets out there through social media. So I feel like, the training that I've already received in the process of becoming a certified foster parent is so much more than my parents ever received in just the adoption process. And I think about, this kind of parenting around trauma and neglect and how you identify those things in your children. It should be for all parents, regardless if you biologically have a child or not.
I always think that too. I'm like, we have to take like classes to drive. You have to get permits to do something, but raising a child, it's like we need some help collectively.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay. And just curious, is there a difference with genders? I know we talked about race, but is there a difference in cost for girl and boy, or a demand for more girls or boys? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. I mean, I've heard that, obviously there was a time, I want to say it was even in the 90s, as most recently, like, female Chinese children were a high adoption, or they were like highly available for adoption because there was this standard in China of like only being able to have so many children in the home. But other than that, I mean, I haven't heard too much around race, around gender or sex. There is an aspect too of, people receiving monthly stipends, especially within the foster care industry. So if you take in a foster child, depending on your state, you might receive, $1,000 a month per child, and so even that was very eye-opening for me, like sitting in on those initial calls and hearing, given the time of COVID, everything was virtual when we started this process, and, sitting in on a call with 30 other adults and someone saying like, well, how many kids can I fit in a one bedroom? Or, I have roommates. How does that work? Like, how many children can I fit? And it's like, it's very cringeworthy, to think about, these children who so desperately need stability to be thrust into somebody who maybe has ulterior motives.
Yes. And I've actually heard about that too, not to be like negative, but again, this is just the reality, and that doesn't mean everyone is doing it, but I have heard that too, that the financial interest could be, outweighing maybe the the benefit of actually truly wanting to help a child. So yeah, there's a lot in there. I have no idea really about how all this works, other than, like I said, that we had friends at work that did adopt a little baby girl who was Black, and the parents are white, which was really neat to see that process. And I really love, it's just so perfect, especially for what's going on now, to see them raise her. She does have contact with her birth mother and siblings. They live like somewhere in the South, and then we're here in Washington, and they've been able to keep a really cool connection and be very aware and conscious to celebrate her, being Black. And literally, like, my friend will post about, I need help for anyone who knows how to work with Black hair, because that's different than like how we would style our hair. You know what I mean? So like, I think it's really cool. There are like a lot of positives to spin it. There are a lot of positive things going on like that too. Conscious parenting, conscious adopting, then moving into a different race, bringing that into your home. Like, I think there's so much goodness happening too. So I want to like celebrate that. But, I mean, do you know, like statistically, are there more non-Caucasian children that are waiting to be fostered and adopted?
Oh yeah.
That would be.
I mean, I don't know the exact stat. I'm in Colorado. There's over 5,000 children in foster care waiting for homes right now.
Wow.
And I've heard statistics around like 60% are children of minority.
Okay.
And so it's like it's pretty. But then that not to go down a rabbit hole on race, but that's an even bigger conversation about, essentially Black and brown families not being supported and having children removed for reasons that white children have continued to stay in abusive homes, know? Yeah. And so there's also a huge stigma around that too.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. There's just so much about this, like fostering could be one episode in itself, and then adoption, but
100%.
There's obviously, are there more kids in foster, like waiting for foster or adoption?
So that's a good question. So there is definitely more children waiting in foster care. Okay. So foster care is basically for children that have been removed from the home or have been abandoned. But I would say 80% of the children that are in foster care have been removed for an unsafe condition, sure. Right? So it can be physical, it can be sexual, it could be neglect. And all of those reasons are reasons that kids are removed every day.
Yeah.
And so, the adoption industry has almost become a surrogate industry. And I think that's what was so surprising for me. When we were looking into domestic adoption, I was talking with one agency and I was saying like, well, what are we looking at for costs, I guess, overall. And she was like, well, I guess it depends on like how bad you want a baby. It could be 50K, it could be 100K. And for us, we're sitting there and we're like, why the range? Like, right. I don't understand, And what we came to find out was, this agency in particular basically sponsors the mom. And so like a woman might be pregnant along the way.
Okay.
And essentially you're paying for her home, like you're paying her rent, you're paying her groceries, you're paying like her medical bills. Okay. And I think, back when I was adopted, I seriously doubt my birth mother received anything for me.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so like now I think, the adoption industry has created a demand, and so it was interesting when we started this process in December of last year. And we were being told by agency after agency, like, oh, we're having a drought of babies right now. Like no one's having babies anymore.
Oh, okay.
And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. And they were like, well, with better birth control, better sex education in schools, like we're just seeing a lack of unplanned pregnancy. And you're like sitting there thinking like, well, great. Isn't that like the point? Like adoption is to serve a purpose of like people not being able to provide. And yet adoption industries are paying women to get pregnant and are, like doing some very under the table things in order to,
that is bizarre.
Essentially then mark up this child, 3 times the amount. So again, it was not the fit for us, and it's not to say that we'll never adopt, but for us, there are so many children in the foster care system. Yeah. And I think, they say a child over the age of 10, like their likelihood to be placed and it finally adopted, it goes down by like 50% every year that they grow over the age of 10.
Okay.
People only want babies. And, for us, we sit in a place where we were like, gosh, like we have space. We, are comfortable financially. Like we're in a place where we could actually take an older child.
Sure.
And so we always say like we're fostering with the willingness to adopt, like meaning if their parental rights have already been terminated or if, they've clearly been in the system so long that's their choice down the road. I think that's where we sit. And if we were to only have a child for a short amount of time, I think we'd be okay with that too.
Yeah. Wow. And that's amazing because that in itself would be really hard if you did become a little attached. That would be emotional, but like, bless your hearts for being open to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a phrase in the foster syndicate, I'll call it, that says like, get attached. Like get attached. Like it's okay. Like if you get attached, that means that child is better off.
Yeah. And you gave them love when they needed it to help them through that transition. Wow. I know. And just that, what you were talking about, just like being paid to have a baby and all that. And then you're thinking there's so many kids that are literally like needing a home now that are already alive. Like that in itself is just heartbreaking. So thank you for shedding light on that. I didn't really think about that. I mean, I kind of knew it, but just hearing this is like such a good reminder. And I mean, like, what are some ways that you think, I know it's a hard question, but like, what are some ways that we can like collectively improve this? I mean, where do you even start with something like this?
Yeah, I think if you have the means and if you have the time and the willingness, like foster.
Yeah.
Like it is a process for sure. And it is, you can either do it through a private agency like we're doing, or you can do it through, your city. There's also a different form of it called CASA. CASA is basically a volunteer job, and your job is to take a foster child out once or twice a month, and essentially be able to report back on how they're doing. You actually report back in the court system, and so it is a serious volunteer position, but you get to spend time with foster youth, and so I think that's a really great place to start, is a CASA volunteer. And then I think there are some really great like nonprofits doing really good work. So Foster the Family is another big one. They will provide suitcases and materials to foster youth that need it between home to home. They say like most foster youth move their belongings, their whole belongings, in a garbage bag every time they switch home. And so this nonprofit does a lot of work to give them backpacks and suitcases. And so they're a really good one too.
That's really cool. Wow. And then do you know like about how long an average like foster, like a stay would be? Like if you were to get placed with the child and they came to stay with you, like what's the like ideal time before they would maybe either go back to their family or whatever?
Yeah, I don't think there is like a one size fit all.
Sure.
I think, so there's also something called the respite care. So you can become a respite care worker. And it basically means, if a foster family like wants to take a vacation and like they can't take the child with them by law, like sometimes you're not able to take children out of state lines or anything like that, you would essentially babysit for a weekend so that family could go have a vacation, or a mom and dad could go have a date night. So respite is another aspect. So you can become like a certified respite taker. But I think, sometimes children are in home a couple of weeks. Sometimes they're in homes 6 months, and then sometimes they're in homes for years before they go back. So I think that's like where the getting attached part is really tough, is like someone who's had this baby or this child for, 2 years and then they go back. It's like, ultimately that's where they need to be. Sure. And so, you're doing the right thing, but it doesn't mean it doesn't come with being a little bit broken open yourself.
It'd be really hard, but also amazing that you helped them when they needed it. Okay. I just had a question I forgot. So you have them, but also, I mean, again, not knowing a lot about it, if I know it's hard because sometimes they might try to put the child back into their, biological parents' home. But isn't the idea that like moving them around less would be less stressful for the child too, though? Is that a goal, like to try to keep them in like the foster family's home for longer versus like continuing to move them around, or is it just case by case?
I think it's case by case, to be honest, Flo. Like, I don't think that I personally don't have enough experience with that, but I would assume that it is dependent on what's going on in the lives of the birth parents, and I mean, I've talked to our caseworker and she said like at times it's not safe for a child to go back. So that's another thing that, caseworkers are constantly evaluating, is like the safety of the circumstances that child would be placed in. Right. And sometimes that goes into play with, let's say you do adopt a child, or let's say you do, foster to adopt in that sense. And, you do know everything about that child's birth parents, but it's not safe for the child to know. Like, how are you going to manage that? Like, when do you decide it's appropriate to say like, yeah, I know who your birth parents are? Or, I think it was kind of a blessing in a sense that I didn't find my birth mom until I was older, because I was in such a different state to be able to take in the information I did get from her,
that is true.
Versus being some 16-year-old who was probably full of emotion.
Right. That's true. Yeah, there could be benefits and the beauty to finding things like that out when you're a little more mature and maybe more ready for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think, I don't know. I'm just like thinking about, my heart just like goes out to any kid. Like the transition period just seems like all those transitions and move and not knowing. And I just like how much love that they need. And that's why it is so cool that there are people like you that are willing to look into this and to do this. I mean, I just keep thinking like all they really need is just like stability and love. Like every child deserves to have that.
Yeah, I mean, when we went through our foster care training, I remember they asked one question and they said it was like a true or false exercise. And they asked us all these different questions. And one of the questions was, I think it was like 65% of the kids in foster care are sexually abused. True or false? And I was like, I'm going to go with false, because I felt like in my soul, like it just couldn't be. That seemed really high, like almost 70%, And so I was like, maybe it's like 60, maybe it's 50. Yeah. I felt like it was a trick question. And so I was like, okay, false, and she was like, you're right. Like, why do you think it's false? And I was like, I just feel like maybe 65 or 68 is too high. I forget what the statistic was. She was like, it's actually false because it's 85%.
Yeah. I had a feeling it was going to be higher.
And I was like, oh my gosh.
That's
like
horrible.
Yeah. And so then it's like, these kids are being shuffled, not to, to your point, but then it's like, where is a safe place for them to stay? Right. Like abuse, it happens in foster homes. Abuse happens, in their biological homes. Right. So it's like, there's this lack of safety and stability for kids. And I guess at the end of the day, if I can help with that, like that is the goal.
That is amazing. Wow. Yeah. There's a lot of kids that need help. So if people are watching this and thinking about it themselves, wanting to either adopt or foster, can you give just a quick glimpse of how long does it take? Like the interview process, them scoping you out. I know they have to come to your home. They have to, check with your employer. Like I remember actually verifying employment for the people that I, talked about earlier. Like I know there's a lot that goes into it, which rightfully so. Even with that, it sounds like things slip through and you can't always find the perfect people. There's still abuse happening in foster homes, which is awful, but they try to scope you out as best as they can. What does that look like? And like you said, I mean, you don't have to say a dollar amount necessarily, but obviously there's money involved. And I mean, is that just paying admin fees or?
Well, I think, that's probably where that whole foster to adopt section came from, because it was like significantly cheaper to foster a child. Like you actually receive a stipend when you foster. So ultimately, whatever you invest into foster care, it pays itself back. And so then people got into that industry thinking like, oh, great, I can get a free adoption essentially. And so that's where like the term foster to adopt comes. And it's like, that's not what foster care is about. Foster care is about reunification, foster with willingness to adopt, have that, say it's a 12-year-old whose parental rights have already been terminated, but that's a different circumstance, than someone crossing their fingers for a baby, For us, I mean, we started the process in December and we're still not certified for foster care.
Okay.
I think COVID, has obviously slowed things down because they're not able to be in person and do things the same way. But I also think that depending on the agency or the city that you work with, you might have a different experience, but our agency has been incredibly thorough.
Okay.
And I mean, they want to know all your dirt. They want to know, they look at your tax returns. They look at, your home. You have to baby proof your home, even if you're taking in a 16-year-old, so there's a lot that goes into it. They say don't expect to be placed within a year. So from certification to a year out, you could receive a child and you could, be waiting. So it can take, it's not a quick process, I guess is my answer.
And I would assume they try and find, I don't really know how to word this right. Like, I don't want to say a match, but like if, I don't know how to say it. Like for instance,
a match.
Yeah.
It is absolutely a match.
Okay.
So the way that it works in this case, and I can only speak for my own agency, but essentially they'll create a profile for me and my husband. And then essentially then they'll go try to match that profile based on what we've said. So for us, and I don't mind sharing, but like we've said, we're open from infant to 12, but we've said that 5 to 12 is probably our sweet spot. Okay. So we told our caseworker that, we want older children. Yeah. We've also said that we would like a sibling set. So another piece of the adoption industry is siblings are split up so much that we really wanted to provide a space for two.
Yeah.
And then we said any gender, any race. Okay. And then we also said like up to, up to certain medical and behavioral, levels too.
Sure.
So they get real deep into what that looks like.
Good,
for us, we pretty much said we were open to anything except for when it came to like animal abuse. You mentioned earlier, like having puppies in the home. Yeah, it just was a hard line for the two of us.
Sure.
But at that point, then they look for a child who has almost the same attributes or is looking for a family with the same kind of skill set. And then the match will happen.
Yeah.
And at that point, then they'll bring that file back to us. We would be able to evaluate that child's case file and then make a decision.
Sure. That's really neat. Yeah. I mean, again, it's completely different, but I have been matched with a girl through the big brother, big sister. And I mean, again, completely different, but we do spend a lot of time together. Well, we don't as much anymore. She's older, but like I met her when she was 10, she's 16, and we're still in each other's lives. But the same thing, they did a match thing. And I do actually think there's a lot of, it's a higher success rate, I think, to have that. So that's really neat. Wow. Well, I'm really excited to see what happens for you guys. And I'm just like so grateful to know people like you that are willing to open up the space in your home and to help. And I know your experience is a little different because you wasn't as traumatic, and you had good parents, but just giving, I don't know, like you said, you have that understanding. So I think that's so perfect for you to then carry on to help, another child or two or however many that you guys are blessed to take care of. I'm excited to see that for you guys. And thank you for wanting to do that and help and love people.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you have learned that you would like to share, or just any like advice or words of wisdom? Maybe there's people that are adopted that are struggling with things or that are thinking about entering into adoption and fostering. Any last like words?
Yeah, I think that your self-worth can't be dependent on someone else's life decision. And so, for me, I always knew that the best decision was made for the best life, and it's not to say that had my birth mom decided to keep me, that I couldn't have had a good life with her. But I think that she wanted more for me than she was able to give. Yeah. And I think that there is a lot of grace in that for her and for her path. And I think even as I have started to kind of walk this path myself in this different avenue through foster care, but it's made me think a lot about the decisions she's made. And it's made me think a lot about the impact and the trauma that she went through and how it, for sure shaped her life, and so I think I'm very grateful to her. And I think she knows that. So I think that is a good thing for us.
I love that. You just said that, like having grace, because it's actually a lot different than the misconception of some people might think that aren't familiar with adoption. They might just think like, oh, the parent didn't want them or they just didn't deal with it. But actually there's so many like your mom that probably loved you and it was so hard, but knew that they couldn't give you what they had hoped for and that you deserved. And so they were actually giving you a gift of a home that could take care of you better in that time. So I do actually think she really did, care about your well-being. And I think having that grace and understanding is really important. Yeah, I think,
one of the questions that I asked her, I had started reading that book about the women who went away. And it was talking about like what happened after these women gave birth in these birthing homes. And, it sparked a thought for me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder if they took me from her right away, or like, I wonder if I stayed with her. And so, she and I, talk a lot through Messenger. And so I just, shot her message and I was like, hey, I need to respect that this question will bring up trauma for you. And I also understand if you don't want to answer it. And so if this is not something you want to discuss, like no harm, no foul. Yeah. And I just said, but I'm so curious, like, did they take me from you right away, or did I stay with you for a little while? And she was like so open, but basically she said that, I stayed with her for 3 days before they took me.
Oh, wow.
And I just thought, I cannot imagine a woman's grief and trauma from having a child removed from them after they've gone through something so traumatic as giving birth on their own without a husband or a spouse or a support system, to make such a strong decision.
Yeah.
And so I think, when we talk about welfare for people or things for women, I think about like, what does a trauma response support system look like for someone who has given up a child for adoption? Because I think the amount of depression that women must feel is probably pretty outstanding.
Sure. And naturally there's just got to be some guilt, even though it is for them, or it was the right decision for a betterment of a life, yours or whoever else is, they've been given up for adoption, or foster care. You're right. Like so much grief and so much guilt. And I think that's a big topic that I actually talk about on this podcast spiritually too. Like we all have traumas, and I think a large part of us living here is to figure out how to heal, and help one another heal. And I think you're so right about, there's got to be grief counseling and trauma healing and support for parents, not even just women, because, there are men that are still around in these situations, definitely, or even married, couples, and that needs to be looked at and dealt with, and there needs to be resources for them, because you're right. She did what she needed to for you in that time, but that doesn't mean that she didn't have pain after 3 days being with you and then all that trauma beforehand. I mean, wow, that's just like, we need to make sure that there are resources, better resources, improving continually for parents that are giving children away. That's true. That's a really good point. Wow. Well, thank you for talking about this. This is a very in-depth topic, and we only touched on it, of course, but I think it's important to highlight. I learned a lot today. I hope people watching learned something. And if you are considering it, I hope that Sarah's story has inspired you. Do you have any other resources or places that you could recommend for people to check out if they're looking to do something like you are?
Yeah, I would start to educate yourself with adoptees and the voices from adoptees. I think this is a good start. And then I think there's some other really great ones, especially if you're looking into transracial adoption. I think about your girlfriend who's like, someone help me, I don't know how to handle Black hair. And I think there are so many resources. And in particular, I think of one woman that I can send you for your girlfriend. But, there are adoptees who have come out of the system, who have devoted their lives to becoming voices for adoptee parents, to teach them the lessons that our parents didn't know. Yeah. Because I think the structure of adoption and foster care has changed so much in the last, 20 years. And there are so many resources out there. Foster the Family is, a huge one that I spoke to prior. They're wonderful with giving resources and also linking to other, former foster youth. And then I think for adoption, just being careful about the agency that you look into. There is a lot of, common vernacular around, we're an ethical adoption agency. And it's like, what does that really mean? Right. And so I think there's also a black hole of something called adoptee consultants, which are people that are devoted themselves to helping you match with someone. And I would also walk a fine line with that as well.
Interesting. Actually, I did have one more question. Quickly, can you touch on, not quickly necessarily, I mean, whatever, how much time you have, but I just know it's so detailed, but I guess kind of a broad answer, if you will. What's the main difference between a government funded versus private? You said you're talking to a private. So what is even the difference? I didn't really even know there were private. I thought it was all government. So what does that look like?
Yeah. Are you talking about in regards to foster care, Lo, or are you talking more around adoption?
Either or both, if you can. Yeah.
So adoption, I would say is mostly private. So there's essentially two kinds of adoption. There's three kinds of adoption. There's domestic, there's international, and then there's going to be private, essentially. And so your domestic and your international are typically through like a private entity, we'll call them, or an agency. And then your private individual is like you connect with a mom yourself and you hire a lawyer to process the adoption.
I see. Or even like families, right? Like I've heard before, like an aunt would adopt their sister's child.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are special adoption lawyers that can process that paperwork to sever your biological rights over that child.
Okay.
And that's where I think things have gotten so kind of gnarly on social media, because there are like, I met with one agency and, you know, when we were talking about costs, I was like, gosh, this just seems so astronomical. Like my parents I think they paid 11 grand for me in 1984, which was a lot of money for them.
Yeah.
But to think about, some people are paying, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars for children now.
It's just not realistic.
And so, you know, I had one agency tell me, well, you know, the other option is you could market yourself through social media. And I was like, explain that to me. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah.
And she was like, look at the hashtag looking to adopt. And so, of course, I like fell down the black hole of Instagram, and it's all of these families who are holding up, you know, peg boards essentially that say looking to adopt. And the idea is that if they put their story out on social media, some desperate mom will find them and reach out to them, and they will negotiate the terms for this child.
Interesting.
And so that has become a very, very common form of adoption now, where you are socially telling your story. You create a web page, you create a private Facebook page, you have an Instagram account. It is just a very big dark hole. If you want some
of that sounds like it could be good, because you don't have to go through all the like stuff of like overpaying and like, you know, whatever. But then it also doesn't sound good because you may not have that structure, like checking out the home thoroughly and all that stuff. Right. That's very nerve wracking, actually.
Well, and then it's also a perfect, it's a perfect landing pad for someone who's trying to pull a fast one.
Exactly.
Too. So then like you read story after story of families who have, you know, given $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to these expectant moms who were never pregnant to begin with in the first place.
That's insane. Whoa. Yeah, that gets really dicey.
I mean, if you can afford it, I say go through an agency.
Okay.
I just think that there are some good agencies out there, you know, depending on what state you're in. And I think you just have to really do your homework.
Sure.
And I think that there are also some modern things, like there is an actual website called Adopt Match. And it's basically like a match.com. for birth moms.
Oh, interesting.
And so you do have to meet some qualifications to be on there, which is good, because then it's a safe space for the birth mom to be able to actually,
like, you know, background checks and things.
Yeah. Like no birth mom should ever start a conversation around adoption until that adoptive family has a certified home study done. Totally. And that home study basically ensures that they have this space, the finances, and you know, the mental wellness to be able to take on someone else's child.
Totally. Wow. There are a lot of rabbit holes. This is fascinating. I had no idea, but I mean, it would make complete sense with any other industry, what kind of stuff's going on social media. I mean, wow. Okay. Well, you shed a lot of light, and I know I learned a ton today. Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, is there anything in closing that you want to say, or?
No, I think, thanks for having me on. Hopefully this has helped. If anybody has any questions, feel free to, you can shoot me a DM on Instagram.
I was going to ask if you wanted to share. Yeah,
for sure. Okay. Absolutely. It's Lauren, I'm sure, can post for you, my Instagram handle. And then I'll also give you a couple of handles too, if you want to post some other accounts that, you know, can suggest some good info and like trustworthy advice for anybody that's considering down this path.
Totally. Yeah. In the show notes, if people are watching on YouTube, we'll put in the description. And then also, I never knew this, but in podcasts, Apple, Spotify, etc., there are also show notes. So we will put the resources that you listed. We'll put your handle, and then we'll also put the book that you had mentioned. That sounded really interesting.
Okay, great.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Sarah, for your story.
Of course.
And thank you for you and your husband's commitment to wanting to help a child or children, plural. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that they help us just as much.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for listening to Lauren.live. You can find me on Instagram at RealLaurenLive and on my website, Lauren.live. I would appreciate if you would share, subscribe, all the things, like the video. We've got to keep this circulating, educate people, and spread positivity and love. Thank you so much. Blessings to everybody.